The untold story of the disgraced socialite who disappeared. Newport, 1889. On a cold March morning wrapped in coastal fog, the servants of the Belmont Hotel unlocked a door that should never have been silent. The suite, reserved without end for Newport's most luminous figure, stood frozen in time, as if its occupant had merely stepped out of the world. Heavy silk curtains muted the daylight, untouched champagne glasses waited on pale marble, and a faint trace of expensive perfume clung to the air like a memory refusing to fade. On a delicate writing desk lay a letter begun but never finished, its final line trailing into nothing, unsigned, unresolved. Isabella Fairmont, once the heartbeat of American high society, was gone. No farewell, no struggle, only absence, sharp and total. Her disappearance seeped through Newport like a sickness. The city of grand verandas and guarded smiles would spend decades whispering her name behind lace fans and closed doors. Officials searched, questioned, speculated, and slowly uncovered truths so corrosive that influential hands moved quickly to bury them. Entire police files vanished into vaults. Prominent families paid dearly for silence. What remained was a mystery carefully dressed in respectability, and a woman erased as thoroughly as ink washed from parchment. To understand why her vanishing sent terror through gilded parlors, one must return to the years when Newport ruled America's imagination. This was an era where wealth screamed instead of spoke, where summer palaces rose like monuments to human excess. Along Bellevue Avenue, fortunes built on steel rail and shipping glittered beneath chandeliers imported from Europe. In this world, Isabella Fairmont did not merely belong, she dominated. Born Isabella Catherine Aldridge, she carried the dangerous allure of both old lineage and new money. Her father commanded fleets along the eastern seaboard, while her mother traced bloodlines back to the earliest colonial families. Society adored such contradictions. Isabella herself sealed the fascination. Raven hair framed a face too striking to ignore, eyes sharp with intelligence and invitation, a presence that bent rooms toward her without effort. Fashion houses competed for her favor. Men measured their relevance by her attention. Her marriage to Theodore Fairmont elevated her even further. He was solid, respectable, heir to an industrial empire, the perfect counterweight to her brilliance. Their estate, Rosecliff Manor, rose in marble and manicured hedges, a palace sustained by invisible labor and endless expense. Within its walls, power was poured into crystal glasses and passed discreetly between handshakes. Senators laughed beside foreign nobles. Contracts worth fortunes were whispered between courses. An invitation from Isabella could open doors that money alone could not. Newspapers chronicled her every movement, treating her life as public property. Her charity work, her patronage of music and theater, her impeccable taste were praised endlessly. Even the president once sat at her table, proof that her influence stretched far beyond Newport's cliffs. But beneath the sparkle lived a constant, gnawing danger. This society thrived on appearances, and appearances were weapons. A single rumor could ruin bloodlines built over generations. The first fracture appeared during a summer later remembered as the season when shadows grew teeth. Isabella was seen dining alone with Jonathan Pembroke, an architect newly arrived, young enough to be reckless and intriguing enough to be noticed. He carried an air of mystery that unsettled Newport's rigid order. His work spoke of ambition and darkness intertwined, Gothic lines and daring restorations that seemed to resurrect the past rather than honor it. Pembroke was not merely handsome. He was unsettling. His gaze lingered too long, his smile suggested knowledge he should not possess. He moved through drawing rooms as if observing a performance, rather than participating in it. When Isabella met him during church planning discussions, witnesses later described the moment as a silent rupture. Something passed between them, immediate and irreversible. What began as professional collaboration ignited into a bond both intoxicating and catastrophic. They tried to be discreet, but Newport notices everything. Walks taken at improper hours. Conversations that stopped too abruptly. Glances heavy with promise and threat. Gossip spread like smoke, curling into every salon. Isabella's flawless image began to crack, and behind it, secrets strained to escape. Pembroke, it was whispered, knew things about business dealings hidden from ledgers, about alliances forged in darkness, about debts that could never be repaid with money. As the rumors thickened, Isabella changed. Her laughter grew brittle, invitations were declined, letters burned instead of answered. Those closest to her later spoke of fear in her eyes, a sense that she was being hunted by forces she herself had awakened. Pembroke vanished from society just as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind unfinished projects and unanswered questions. And then, on that fog-drowned morning, Isabella followed him into oblivion. Investigators found no body, no ransom, no confession, only fragments. A torn diary page hinting at betrayal, financial records suggesting blackmail. Testimonies altered after midnight visits from powerful men. The truth assembled itself, briefly horrifying and undeniable, before being deliberately dismantled. Files sealed, witnesses silenced, history rewritten. Today the Belmont Hotel still stands, elegant and indifferent. Guests sleep unaware that one room once held the collapse of an empire built on lies. If you listen closely, some say you can still sense her presence in the hush before dawn. A perfume note in empty corridors. The scratch of a pen finishing a sentence that was never meant to be read. This is the world of gospel of the haunted, where forgotten stories breathe in the dark, and the past refuses to stay buried. Isabella Fairmont did not simply disappear. She was erased, and the truth, like her ghost, still waits for someone brave enough to follow it into the fog. When two formidable souls sense a reflection of themselves in another, restraint becomes fragile and reason begins to rot from within. Jonathan Pembroke's visits to Rosecliff Manor were always explained away as business, his presence justified by rolled blueprints and murmured discussions of stone and glass. Yet once inside those walls, time seemed to dissolve. Isabella and Pembroke would vanish for long stretches, drifting through gardens trimmed with obsessive care, or sealing themselves inside her private study where heavy doors swallowed sound. The household servants, drilled to see nothing and remember less, still noticed the change. They heard the difference in Isabella's laughter when Pembroke stood nearby, softer yet sharper, as if charged with danger. They counted the frequency of his arrivals, the envelopes bearing his unmistakable hand, the way her mood brightened and darkened according to his presence. Theodore Fairmont remained blind, consumed by furnaces, contracts, and the relentless expansion of his steel empire. He trusted in his wife's mastery of social life. He praised Pembroke's designs, commended Isabella for her impeccable judgment, and never questioned the hours lost behind closed doors. That trust would later become a private torture replayed endlessly in his mind. But in that summer he saw only what comforted him. To his eyes, Isabella was still the flawless hostess, gliding through obligations with elegance, masking the storm gathering beneath her silk gowns. Newport itself, however, saw everything. The city functioned like a living surveillance network, every glance a report, every whisper a record. By late summer, suspicion thickened into certainty. By early autumn, the unspoken verdict was sealed. Isabella Fairmont, the untouchable queen, had crossed a line that could never be erased. Proof arrived not as facts, but as moments. She was seen entering Pembroke's rented studio under cover of afternoon light. She was observed leaning too closely to him in public halls, their foreheads nearly touching, voices low and urgent. And then came the story that spread like poison through drawing rooms. A maid in the employ of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt claimed she had witnessed an embrace in the conservatory during a private dinner, bodies pressed together amid exotic blooms, their restraint finally shattered. From that moment, the machine turned. Invitations grew scarce. Smiles cooled. Conversations shortened. The intricate dance of Newport society adjusted itself with chilling efficiency, repositioning Isabella from center to liability. Doors once flung open now closed politely but firmly, yet Isabella seemed untouched by the shift, as if insulated by a fever that dulled all warning signs. Friends later said she appeared intoxicated, not with wine, but with devotion so consuming it erased caution. She continued seeing Pembroke with brazen intensity, no longer hiding, almost daring judgment to strike her down. Judgment arrived in ink and paper. One October morning, the New York Herald detonated a social bomb. A columnist hiding behind the name Observer published a merciless exposé beneath a headline that branded Isabella as fallen, ruined, unclean. The article dismantled her reputation with surgical cruelty, laying out meetings, sightings, whispers, and insinuations. But the most devastating blow lay deeper. Pembroke, it claimed, was no romantic idealist. He was described as a man drowning in gambling debts, a drifter who moved from city to city, leaving wealthy women lighter in both purse and dignity. The column alleged that Isabella had been funding him, funneling money from her own accounts, and that treasured pieces from the Fairmont collection had quietly disappeared to cover his losses. Theodore read the article as though struck by lightning. Betrayal alone would have shattered him, but this was something worse. His wife had not only strayed, she had been compromised, possibly manipulated by a man feeding on her passion. The humiliation burned deeper when he realized how many had known while he remained ignorant. Associates, rivals, servants, all watching him play the fool. That night the walls of Rosecliff Manor bore witness to its most violent argument. In the library, beneath shelves of leather-bound volumes and the accusing stare of ancestral portraits, Theodore confronted Isabella. At first, she denied everything, her voice steady, rehearsed. But the truth could not survive the evidence. Bank records spread across the desk like open wounds, transfers traced with undeniable clarity. Faced with numbers that could not lie, she collapsed into confession. She admitted the affair, insisted her love was real, swore the money was given freely, a gift of devotion rather than deceit. Theodore's answer was cold and immediate. He demanded the affair end. He ordered her return to Boston, isolation from temptation, submission to a carefully planned campaign to repair their name. To him, this was mercy disguised as control. To Isabella, it was a prison sentence. Her refusal came without hesitation. She declared her marriage a mistake, her love for Pembroke absolute. She spoke the word divorce, as if daring the universe to strike her dead for it. The argument raged until the house itself seemed to tremble. Voices rose, cracked, shattered. Doors slammed. Footsteps echoed across marble as Isabella fled the library, leaving Theodore surrounded by silence and ruin. When he emerged the next morning, those who saw him barely recognized the man. His posture sagged, his eyes hollow, as though years had been carved into him overnight. What followed deepened the horror. Theodore's scrutiny of their finances revealed the full extent of the damage. Vast sums had vanished into Pembroke's hands, amounts that staggered even a man of Theodore's wealth. Worse still were the sales. Artworks and jewelry supposedly rotated out of fashion had been sold hastily, cheaply, carelessly. Among them was a diamond necklace heavy with family history, reduced to mere currency. Whether Isabella had been careless or deliberately deceptive no longer mattered. The truth was undeniable. Love had hollowed her out, leaving only echoes and debt behind. And in the shadows cast by this revelation, something darker stirred, waiting patiently for the final act. The final wound was delivered quietly, with ink-stained reports and the dull certainty of truth. Theodore's investigators followed Pembroke's trail backward through other cities, peeling away layers of charm to reveal a familiar pattern of ruin. In Pittsburgh, they found a woman married to influence and industry, drained of money and dignity before Pembroke vanished without warning. In Richmond, grieving widow of a tobacco empire told a similar story. Her loneliness expertly exploited, her fortune diminished, her faith shattered. The findings described not a tragic lover but a predator, refined and methodical, selecting his victims with unnerving accuracy. When Theodore laid these discoveries before Isabella, he expected collapse. What he received was something far more disturbing. She defended Pembroke with a fervor that bordered on devotion. She dismissed the other women as misunderstandings, insisted their bond existed outside ordinary rules, claimed their connection was real in a way nothing else had ever been. Watching her speak, Theodore realized with a cold certainty that frightened him more than betrayal. His wife was lost inside a story that Pembroke had written for her. A fantasy so complete it had overwritten reality. She could no longer see the bars of the cage because she believed them to be wings. By late autumn, Isabella Fairmont had become untouchable. In Newport, and not in the way she once had been. Her name traveled faster than she did, printed and reprinted until it lost all mercy. The scandal spread beyond Rhode Island, transforming her disgrace into a national spectacle. Readers devoured the narrative of beauty undone, of wealth corrupted by desire. Theodore responded with an ultimatum stripped of emotion. She would publicly renounce Pembroke, retreat from society into isolation, surrender control of her finances, and submit to a slow reconstruction of their name. In return, he would spare her the final humiliation of divorce. Isabella answered by vanishing. For days, no one knew where she had gone. Then she was found in Providence, hidden behind an assumed name in a modest boarding house, surrounded by unfamiliar walls and borrowed anonymity. When Theodore and his attorneys confronted her, she was calm, almost luminous. What she offered them was not surrender, but war. She claimed that through Pembroke she had glimpsed the machinery behind Newport's polished facade. She spoke of mansions built not just for luxury but for concealment. Hidden rooms, narrow passages behind walls, safes sealed behind fireplaces and beneath wine cellars. According to Isabella, powerful families had commissioned these features to bury proof of crimes they could not afford to let daylight touch. Her accusations were precise and terrifying. She named senators, magnates, dynasties. She described documents hidden behind brick and stone, evidence of bribery, forged deeds, manipulated markets. She claimed to possess knowledge that could unravel fortunes overnight. Theodore's lawyers doubted her proof, yet fear took root instantly. In a world where reputations were currency, even an accusation could trigger investigations that exposed dangerous truths. Whether Isabella spoke fact or fantasy no longer mattered. The damage would be catastrophic either way. A meeting was arranged in secret, deep within the Belmont Hotel, shielded from curious ears. Representatives of Newport's most powerful families gathered beneath chandeliers that had witnessed countless deals sealed with smiles. Isabella entered not as a disgraced woman, but as a negotiator sharpened by desperation. Her demands were breathtaking. Money delivered in silence. Pembroke's debts erased without trace. Passage to Europe, permanent and unquestioned. In return, she would disappear. Her knowledge would vanish with her. The story would end. The discussion stretched deep into the night, voices low, faces tight with calculation. When agreement finally came, it arrived with conditions colder than Isabella had anticipated. She and Pembroke would be separated. No contact, no return. Their exile would be absolute. She accepted without protest, though those present later said her eyes drifted often, as if listening to something none of them could hear. When asked if she understood the finality of what she was agreeing to, she smiled softly and spoke of sacrifice, of love that demanded obliteration. The money arrived days later, delivered discreetly to her room. Travel plans were finalized. Pembroke had already sailed, gone ahead into the fog of Europe, unreachable and silent. Isabella was scheduled to follow, her passage booked, her name erased from ledgers and conversations alike. On paper, everything was settled. In reality, something was unraveling. Her final days unfolded with unsettling care. She returned to Newport and took rooms at the Belmont under her maiden name, shedding her married identity like a skin. The choice carried a quiet symbolism, a retreat into who she had been before wealth, before scandal, before love poisoned her blood. She wrote letters she never sent. She wandered halls late at night, speaking to no one, listening to echoes. Staff later recalled her gaze lingering on mirrors, on doorways, on shadows that seemed too deep for candlelight. She was meant to leave. She never did. The ship sailed without her. Days passed, then weeks. The woman who had orchestrated her own erasure vanished before it could be completed. No body was found. No witness stepped forward. Newport closed ranks, sealing records, burying questions beneath layers of silence. Isabella Fairmont dissolved into rumor, her fate suspended between scandal and myth, and still something lingers. In the Belmont Hotel, in the spaces between walls, in the careful quiet of old mansions built to hide truths. Some say Isabella never intended to flee. Some believe she learned too much. Others whisper that love led her somewhere darker than exile. Whatever the truth, it was powerful enough to make an entire society look away. This is the domain of Gospel of the Haunted, where stories do not end, they wait. And Isabella Fairmont's final week remains a wound that never closed, a shadow stretching forward through time, asking one question in the dark. What price is too high for silence? She returned to the Belmont not as a fugitive, but as a woman stepping backward through her own life, retreating toward the moment before everything fractured. The staff would later remark on how composed she appeared, how strangely peaceful. Isabella Fairmont no longer moved like someone being chased. She moved like someone who had already decided how the story would end. Meals were taken alone, trays left untouched for long stretches before being quietly removed. No callers were announced. No laughter echoed from her rooms. Instead, she spent hours writing, page after page, her pen never hesitating, as though the words had been waiting for her all along. The young desk clerk, William Chen, noticed her more than most. He saw the steady rhythm of her days, the careful way she folded letters, the stack of envelopes that passed through his hands. He could not remember the names or destinations, only the weight of them, the sense that each letter carried something final. When asked later, he said it felt as though she were distributing pieces of herself across the country, scattering her voice where her body would no longer be. Then came the request that unsettled everyone who heard it. Isabella asked for a photographer, not a casual sitting but a formal portrait arranged with urgency. Marcus Steinberg welcomed her into his studio, expecting a routine commission from a society woman preparing for travel. What he received instead was something he would never forget. Isabella posed for hours, changing positions, adjusting angles, demanding precision. She paid in cash, insisted the plates be developed immediately, and waited in silence as her image emerged from chemicals and shadow. Steinberg later said her beauty remained undeniable, but it was sharpened by something else. Resolve. Grief. A gaze fixed on a horizon only she could see. She touched her jewelry often, lingering on a ruby brooch said to have passed through generations of her family, as though anchoring herself to a lineage she was about to abandon. When he casually suggested another session after her return from Europe, she smiled with a softness that chilled him and said it would not be necessary. The photographs, discovered decades later, show a woman perfectly composed, yet impossibly distant. In several images, her eyes seem to look beyond the lens, towards something waiting patiently outside the frame. As December approached, Isabella's behavior took on a ritualistic quality. She hired a carriage and instructed the driver to take her across Newport, from landmark to landmark, memory to memory. The casino where alliances were forged beneath chandeliers, the church where vows had once felt eternal, the cliffside path where admiration followed her footsteps like a tide. At each stop she lingered silent, absorbing the place as if committing it to memory for the last time. The driver later said it felt less like a tour and more like a farewell procession, one meant for an audience that could not speak. That night she returned to the Belmont and requested a late supper. The night manager delivered it himself and found her transformed. Gone was the practical travel attire. She now wore a deep blue gown that caught the lamplight with every movement, her jewelry carefully chosen, the ruby brooch glowing like a wound against silk. She thanked him for his service, for the discretion of the staff, for everything. Her generosity startled him. When he objected, she spoke quietly about money as a fleeting privilege, something to be used before it lost all meaning. Near midnight, William Chen saw her one last time. She descended the staircase dressed for travel, carrying a small leather case, her posture straight, her expression calm. She nodded to him politely, declined assistance, and said her arrangements were complete. Through the front windows he watched her step into the night. Fog had rolled in thick from the harbor, the kind that erased distance and swallowed sound. Within seconds, Isabella Fairmont dissolved into the pale mist, her figure fading until there was nothing left to follow. She never reached her ship. When morning came and she failed to appear for departure, alarm spread quickly. Theodore Fairmont contacted the authorities, and an investigation unlike any Newport had seen began to unfold. The police were accustomed to crimes of passion and profit, not vanishings wrapped in wealth and influence. Chief Detective Samuel Harrison approached the case with deliberate care, sensing from the beginning that this disappearance carried weight far beyond a missing person. Witnesses were questioned, timelines reconstructed. Every step of Isabella's final days was retraced. What emerged was deeply unsettling. She had not behaved like a woman planning escape, nor like one seized by panic. She had behaved like someone closing a door. The contents of her hotel room reinforced that impression. Her belongings were arranged with intention, not haste. Clothing folded, personal items placed neatly as though left behind on purpose. Equally telling was what could not be found. Jewelry she had worn day earlier had vanished, including a diamond bracelet of considerable value. Drafts of letters lay scattered among her papers, words that read like farewells, though the finished versions were missing. And in the fireplace, investigators found the charred remains of a document only partially destroyed. Enough survived to suggest names, figures, and something that had been deemed too dangerous to exist intact. No body was recovered, no ransom demanded, no confession surfaced. Leads dissolved into silence. Witnesses forgot details. Records disappeared. Newport society closed ranks with practiced efficiency, sealing the truth behind money and reputation. Officially, Isabella Fairmont vanished into the fog. Unofficially, her absence became a warning. Even now, the story refuses to rest. The Belmont Hotel stands elegant and quiet, its corridors heavy with unspoken history. Some claim that on fog-bound nights, footsteps echo on the stairs long after guests have retired. Others swear they have smelled perfume where no woman stands. Whether Isabella fled, was silenced, or chose a darker ending, no one can say for certain. This is gospel of the haunted, where disappearances are never empty, and silence is never innocent. Isabella Fairmont did not simply walk away from her life. She stepped into a space where truth, power, and fear converged. And whatever claimed her in that mist ensured that the price of silence would echo far longer than her name ever did. From the ashes of the burned paper, the investigation drew its first truly unsettling breath. What little survived the flames revealed fragments of numbers, careful sums written with purpose, and initials placed with deliberate intent. Among them was J.P., easily connected to Jonathan Pembroke, but another set of letters caused a chill to pass through Detective Harrison. W.B., at first, meaningless, until realization struck with quiet force. William Blackstone, a senator. A man Isabella had named in her whispered threats. The fire had not erased everything. It had only obscured enough to make the truth harder to reach. Harrison's attention turned fully toward Pembroke wherever he might be hiding. Letters were sent to London. Inquiries were made through official channels. The response that returned felt like a door slamming shut. The address provided by Isabella's lawyers led nowhere, nothing more than a forwarding service that collected names without faces. British authorities searched their registries and found nothing. No hotel stays, no boarding house records, no man matching Pembroke's description. It was as if he had evaporated mid-journey. The steamship logs deepened the unease. A ticket had been purchased, a name had been entered, but the passenger never boarded. Harrison stared at the manifest and felt the shape of something wrong taking form. Either Pembroke had traveled under another identity, or he had never intended to leave at all. The escape had been theater, and Isabella, willingly or not, had been part of the stagecraft. As Harrison peeled back Pembroke's past, the illusion of respectability dissolved. His credentials existed, but always just out of reach, just thin enough to tear under pressure. Projects in Pittsburgh and Richmond bore his mark, yet in each city he had vanished abruptly, leaving unpaid debts and unanswered questions. Wealthy women appeared again and again in the margins of his life, each relationship ending with money missing and silence following. Pembroke was not a lover swept up by scandal, he was something far colder. The most disturbing revelations surfaced when Harrison examined Pembroke's architectural work in Newport. With the help of inspectors, walls were measured, blueprints re-examined, rumors tested against stone. In more than one mansion, hidden voids were discovered. Narrow passages behind bookcases, compartments built into foundations, spaces designed not for beauty but for concealment. These features had been completed long before Isabella's affair became public. The implication was unavoidable. Pembroke's relationship with her may not have been chance. It may have been strategy. Then, just as the case threatened to collapse under its own weight, a woman stepped forward from the margins. Margaret Winthrop was old, overlooked, dismissed by those who once employed her, a seamstress who had stitched gowns for Newport's elite and learned the cost of knowing too much. She demanded privacy. She demanded protection. And when she spoke, her words rearranged the investigation entirely. She claimed that on the night Isabella vanished, she had been working late at one of Newport's grand homes when voices drifted across the courtyard. Drawn by curiosity and unease, she positioned herself near a window and watched as Isabella appeared, not alone, but flanked by two men she did not recognize. The exchange was tense. Isabella's movements sharp, her posture defiant. The men stood still, listening, waiting. After a time, one of them handed her something small, possibly an envelope, possibly something heavier. Then the three entered a closed carriage and disappeared into the night. Harrison wanted to dismiss her immediately. Her reputation worked against her. She was known to talk, to speculate, to see drama where none existed. But then she described the ruby brooch, the way it caught the moonlight, the exact placement at Isabella's collar. A detail too precise to invent. The room grew quiet. The case shifted again, tilting toward something darker. As whispers spread, so did unease. This was no longer a matter of a woman choosing exile or escape. It was beginning to resemble extraction, removal, control. Harrison followed the money next, guided by instinct rather than protocol. With federal assistance, he traced the funds meant to finance Isabella's disappearance. The money had moved. The account existed, but it had never been touched. Not a single withdrawal, not a single signature matching Isabella's hand. Worse still, the account had been opened using forged documents. The handwriting was wrong. The timing was wrong. The implication was chilling. Either someone had posed as Isabella during negotiations, or the entire agreement had been a carefully constructed illusion meant to distract from a far more permanent solution. Silence bought not with exile, but with erasure. The final revelation struck like a death knell. Jonathan Pembroke had not vanished into shadow. He had been found dead days earlier in a Boston boarding house. The date was unmistakable, the day before Isabella walked into the fog. His death had been recorded quietly, buried among routine notices. Official cause listed as heart failure. Convenient. Too convenient. The boarding house keeper told a different story. On the day Pembroke died, two men had visited him. Well-dressed. Polite. They claimed to be business associates. They stayed for hours behind a closed door. When they left, Pembroke was never seen alive again. No struggle was reported. No noise, just a room that went silent forever. Harrison understood then what he had been circling since the beginning. Pembroke was a liability. Isabella was a threat, and Newport's elite did not survive by allowing either. The affair had never been about love alone. It had been leverage. Knowledge exchanged in whispers. And when knowledge becomes dangerous, it must be contained. Isabella Fairmont walked into that fog believing she was choosing her fate, or perhaps she already knew she no longer had a choice. Whether she was taken, silenced, or sacrificed to preserve secrets carved into marble walls, the result was the same. She disappeared completely. No grave, no confession, no justice. This is gospel of the haunted, where the past does not rest and truth is hunted like prey. Isabella's story did not end on that winter night. It fractured into echoes, into hidden rooms and sealed records, into the quiet understanding that some lives are erased not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered too well. And somewhere in Newport, behind brick and stone, the silence still watches, daring anyone to listen too closely. The news of Pembroke's death drifted toward Newport like a delayed funeral bell, arriving days too late to save anyone. By the time the whispers reached the coastal mansions, Isabella Fairmont had already made her final arrangements. The timing gnawed at Detective Harrison's mind, because it suggested something far worse than coincidence. If Isabella had believed she was meeting Pembroke or fleeing to join him beyond the reach of scandal, then every step she took on that last night carried her deeper into a carefully prepared snare. She would have walked forward trusting a future that no longer existed, unaware that the man she believed to be her escape had already been erased. From that moment, Harrison's focus narrowed to the shadows surrounding Pembroke's final hours. In Boston, two strangers had entered his boarding house, dressed like gentlemen, speaking softly, leaving no names behind. In Newport, an elderly seamstress had glimpsed two silent figures beside Isabella as she vanished into a closed carriage. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. Harrison followed it until it led him somewhere far more disturbing than a single killer or a jealous lover. It led him into the machinery of power itself. Quietly, relentlessly, he uncovered a shared thread binding several of Newport's most influential families. Each had turned, at different times, to the same private security firm to make inconvenient problems disappear without noise. Pinkerton Detective Agency. The name carried authority, respectability, and a reputation for discretion. But when federal pressure forced the release of internal files, the language within those pages curdled the air in Harrison's lungs. Isabella Fairmont had not merely been observed. She had been evaluated, tracked, measured, and judged. The reports described her movements, her moods, her correspondence, her relationships. They spoke of risk, of exposure, of unacceptable consequences should she be allowed to speak freely. And then the tone shifted. Surveillance became strategy. Strategy became recommendation. Words like containment and resolution appeared, dressed in professional politeness, yet vibrating with menace. One entry spoke of the necessity of permanent discretion, noting that Isabella's emotional volatility could conveniently explain almost any outcome. Harrison understood then that the plan had already crossed a line from observation into intent. As if that realization were not enough, another discovery waited beneath layers of dust and blueprints. Harrison examined the original architectural designs Jonathan Pembroke had submitted for various Newport estates. Most appeared extravagant but harmless, symbols of Gilded Age excess. But one set of plans stopped him cold. Beneath the Pitton Mansion's wine cellar lay a space that did not exist on any official record. A chamber concealed behind stone, shielded with metal large enough not for treasures but for something living, or dying. With a warrant secured, the investigation descended into the Pitton Mansion on a grey February morning. Valentine's Day arrived without warmth. Charles Patton himself had fled to New York as soon as legal authority loomed, leaving behind a house frozen in opulence. The rooms gleamed with polished wood and velvet silence, as though wealth itself were holding its breath. Down below, the wine cellar greeted them with orderly racks and old stone, everything appearing exactly as it should. Too exactly. Measurements betrayed the lie. Space was missing, invisible but undeniable. Tools struck stone, and the walls surrendered far too easily. Behind it waited a hidden room, sealed with intention, its interior lined and laid to swallow sound. The air inside felt wrong, heavy with the residue of secrecy. And there, in the far corner, lay what remained of Isabella Fairmont. She was wrapped in silk that had once shimmered under chandeliers. The ruby brooch still clung stubbornly to the decaying fabric, catching the dim light as if refusing to be forgotten. Time had ravaged the cloth, but not the accusation it carried. The coroner would later reveal the method of her death. A poison slipped quietly into celebration mixed with champagne in a crystal glass found nearby. A killer's choice, subtle and difficult to trace, designed to leave behind confusion rather than proof. Yet the most unbearable truth was written on the walls themselves. Scratches marred the lead lining, desperate and uneven. Isabella had not slipped gently into sleep. She had awakened in darkness. She had understood. Her fingers had clawed at the barrier while the poison worked its way through her blood. In her hand, investigators found the remains of a note, the paper nearly destroyed, the words blurred into fragments of rage and betrayal. Enough survived to suggest she knew exactly who had condemned her. The case exploded open after that. What had once been framed as scandal management revealed itself as ritualized elimination. The exile agreement, the money, the forged documents, the false hope of escape, all of it had been theater, a performance staged to mask an execution. The two men who met Isabella that night were not escorts, they were agents. Professionals acting on behalf of families whose fortunes could not withstand exposure. The hidden chamber was never meant to protect secrets. It was built to destroy the person who carried them. Harrison's reconstruction left no room for mercy. Isabella had been summoned to the Pitton Mansion under the illusion of final arrangements, drugged beneath chandeliers that reflected wealth without conscience, and entombed alive behind a wall designed to ensure silence. Her death was not collateral damage. It was the objective. In the end, the names involved were too powerful, the consequences too vast. Records were sealed. Charges dissolved into technicalities. Public memory faded by design, but the truth did not vanish. It seeped into the foundations of Newport, into the spaces behind walls and beneath cellars, into every place where privilege believed itself untouchable. This is gospel of the haunted, where fear does not scream, it whispers. Isabella Fairmont's story does not end with her discovery. It lingers in the knowledge that some rooms are built not to hide wealth but to erase people. And if you listen closely, beneath the clink of glasses and the murmur of polite society, you can still hear scratching, faint and furious, demanding to be heard. The deeper the investigation pressed into the shadows, the clearer one truth became, cold and unavoidable. Jonathan Pembroke had not died peacefully in a rented room, claimed by a treacherous heart. His end had been manufactured with precision, a murder camouflaged as weakness of the flesh. He had known too much. The architect carried intimate knowledge of spaces never meant to exist, chambers concealed behind stone and silence, and of what those spaces were designed to contain. If Isabella's accusations had ever been fully examined, Pembroke would have been a living map to the crime. That made him a liability. And liabilities in this world were erased. His death had been carefully placed on the calendar like a final chess move, occurring just before Isabella's own disappearance. The timing ensured she would never learn that her supposed ally was already gone. When she stepped into the night, believing an escape awaited her, the trap was already sealed. By the time her body was discovered, the chain of intent was unmistakable. 2 murders, bound together by silence, executed with professional patience. When arrests finally came, the shock rippled through American high society like a fracture through crystal. Names spoken only in reverence were suddenly spoken in courtrooms. Charles Petain, William Blackstone, others whose fortunes had shaped railways, steel, and legislation itself. 2 operatives from the very agency hired to protect reputations now stood accused of ending a life and hiding its remains. For a brief electric moment it seemed as though the machinery of privilege might finally grind against itself. But justice, like truth, is fragile when surrounded by wealth. Almost immediately, the case began to unravel. Witnesses who had once spoken with trembling certainty grew hesitant, then uncertain, then silent. Mrs. Margaret Winthrop, whose memory had pierced the darkness with a single unmistakable detail, suddenly doubted her own eyes. Other testimonies softened, blurred, or were withdrawn entirely. Evidence vanished from secure rooms, leaving behind only paperwork and unanswered questions. And then came the fire. In Boston, the offices that held the most damning records burned in the night. The flames consumed files, correspondence, internal recommendations, and with them the clearest map of intent. Official statements called it accidental. Investigators knew better. What survived the blaze was too little, too late. The federal inquiry, once aggressive and relentless, slowed as though wading into unseen resistance. Jurisdictions overlapped and clashed. Authority dissolved into argument. Warrants were challenged, procedures questioned. Months vanished into hearings that produced nothing but delay. Investigators who pushed too hard found themselves reassigned, redirected, or quietly removed. By summer, it was evident that forces far beyond Newport's police had closed ranks. The truth was being buried again, this time beneath paperwork and power. The final fracture came from a place no one expected to yield. Theodore Fairmont, Isabella's widowed husband, announced his withdrawal. His statement, released through polished legal language, spoke of grief, exhaustion, and a desire for peace. He claimed he wished to spare his wife further spectacle. Publicly, it sounded like mercy. Privately, it was surrender purchased at a staggering price. Financial records would later reveal the arrangement hidden beneath the condolences. Lucrative government contracts for Fairmont Steel, guarantees of restored standing in elite circles, a future secured in exchange for silence. Theodore agreed to halt cooperation, to endorse the narrative that Isabella had succumbed to despair, that exile and shame had driven her to take her own life. With that, the spine of the prosecution snapped. By autumn, the cases collapsed one by one. Charles Petain walked free, the evidence against him declared insufficient. William Blackstone escaped judgment on procedural grounds, his influence bending law into loopholes. The operatives vanished entirely, swallowed into new names and new lives. Isabella Fairmont was laid to rest quietly, her burial attended by a handful of mourners, her name scrubbed from society columns as though she had never mattered at all. Officially, that was the end. But the dead are patient. In the years that followed, something like reckoning began to unfold, not in courtrooms but in the slow corrosion of empires. Charles Petain never returned to his Newport mansion. Those close to him whispered of sleepless nights, of a man convinced he was being watched by something unseen. He fled to New York, but the walls followed. His business dealings, built on deception Isabella had once uncovered, began to surface under unrelated federal scrutiny. Contracts collapsed, accounts were seized, hidden documents emerged during asset seizures, confirming every crime she had threatened to expose. Peyton's fortune rotted from the inside. He was found dead years later, the official cause mundane, the circumstances anything but. William Blackstone fared no better. A corruption inquiry entirely separate from Isabella's case uncovered evidence long concealed within his own home. Bribes, ledgers, proof of votes sold to the highest bidder. His career imploded in public disgrace. Expelled, stripped, ruined, he died forgotten, his wealth devoured by penalties and shame. One by one, the families who had believed themselves untouchable fell victim to the very rot they had tried to bury. Railroads collapsed, industries fractured, reputations shattered beyond repair. No single investigator connected the dots aloud, but the pattern was unmistakable. Isabella Fairmont's accusations had been true. Every secret she carried eventually surfaced as if guided by her unquiet presence. This is gospel of the haunted, a place where silence never truly holds, where the powerful may delay truth but cannot destroy it. Isabella was erased from records, from headlines, from polite memory, but not from consequence. Her voice echoed through years of ruin, through collapsing fortunes and restless nights. And if you listen closely, beyond history's official version, you can still hear it. Not screaming, not pleading, just waiting. She had known long before the walls closed around her that her voice alone would not be enough. Isabella understood that truth spoken aloud could be strangled, but truth written down had a way of surviving its author. Whatever she had uncovered, whatever names and numbers she had traced through locked drawers and false ledgers, she believed it would outlive her, and in the years that followed it did. Not all at once, not cleanly, but inevitably. The first cracks appeared when federal investigators, chasing an entirely different trail, stumbled into the very scheme Isabella had warned about. A massive web of price manipulation and secret agreements were exposed, confirming that the whispers she carried had been real. The man at the center of that discovery did not live to see the consequences unfold. His death, ruled self-inflicted, splashed across newspapers nationwide, a sudden and dramatic end that many accepted without question. Others noticed how neatly it fit into a growing pattern of powerful men vanishing just before accountability could claim them. Another name soon followed. A banking heir whose fortune had once seemed unshakable watched his empire collapse during the great financial panic of the decade. The same illegal practices Isabella had uncovered years earlier became the fault lines that shattered his institution when the economy turned. He survived the ruin but not the shame. His wealth evaporated, his influence died, and his family name became a cautionary footnote in economic history. Yet perhaps the most fitting reckoning arrived for the organization that had transformed discretion into violence. The private agency that had tracked Isabella, cornered her, and sealed her fate found itself under relentless scrutiny as unrest swept the nation. Congressional inquiries pulled at loose threads, revealing a history of unlawful surveillance, intimidation, and bloodshed conducted in service of the elite. Testimonies piled up. Documents surfaced. The public trust disintegrated. By the turn of the century, the agency's name had become synonymous with corruption. Clients fled. Charges mounted. Its power dissolved into disgrace. Detective Samuel Harrison watched all of this from the margins, carrying the weight of unfinished justice. The case of Isabella Fairmont never loosened its grip on him. After leaving the force, he devoted himself to assembling every fragment he had gathered, every contradiction, every quiet confession. He worked alone, late into the night, compiling a private archive that no court had ever seen. When those papers were discovered after his death, they told a far darker story than the public record ever allowed. Harrison believed Isabella's murder was not an aberration but part of a systematic practice. According to his final conclusions, America's wealthiest families had long relied on intimidation and elimination to preserve their dominance. Those who threatened exposure were not merely silenced socially, but removed entirely. The failure to hold anyone accountable in Isabella's case, Harrison wrote, sent a message that echoed far beyond Newport. A message that money could bend justice, and that influence could erase consequence. He warned that the cost of that lesson would be paid again and again. In Newport, Isabella's name became something people avoided saying aloud. Parents reduced her story to a moral warning, a tale of ambition gone wrong, but that interpretation missed the deeper truth. The real danger, she revealed, was not scandal, but the willingness of the powerful to kill in order to remain untouchable. The mansion where she died seemed to absorb the truth into its bones. After Charles Pian's death, the estate stood abandoned, windows dark, doors sealed. Neighbors spoke of lights flickering inside despite the emptiness, of music drifting across frozen lawns, of a faint perfume lingering in rooms no one had entered for years. When the property was eventually repurposed into an orphanage, the children gave voice to what adults dismissed. They spoke of a woman in elegant dress wandering the corridors at night, and of scratching sounds rising from beneath the floors, slow and deliberate. The institution did not last. A string of unexplained accidents forced its closure. When the building was finally demolished, workers uncovered additional concealed spaces that had escaped earlier investigations. Inside one chamber lay objects that did not belong to Isabella at all, personal effects tied to other disappearances from decades past. The implication was chilling. She had not been the first. The ruby brooch became its own quiet omen. Returned to her husband, then passed on, it refused to settle into obscurity. Wherever it surfaced, tragedy followed. Each new owner met an end that echoed Isabella's, sudden and unsettling. Eventually, the jewel vanished again, leaving behind only rumor and unease. Theodore Fairmont lived out his life in restraint and regret. He never spoke publicly of what he had traded for silence. Instead, he devoted his remaining years to causes that reflected a private reckoning. His legacy funded investigations into crimes that others preferred to ignore, particularly those involving women harmed by power and secrecy. Though no case ever matched the scale of Isabella's, the work exposed patterns long dismissed, forcing uncomfortable truths into reluctant light. And still, one mystery endured above all others. The evidence Isabella had claimed to possess was never found. No ledger, no letters, no final proof. Harrison believed she had hidden it deliberately, sensing the danger closing in. Somewhere in Newport, he suspected, her last safeguard remained concealed, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover it. This is Gospel of the Haunted, where stories do not end when the earth closes over a grave. Isabella Fairmont's death reshaped lives, destroyed empires, and left scars that time could not smooth away. Her presence lingers not as a scream, but as a question that refuses to fade. What happens when truth is buried alive, and what happens when it refuses to stay buried? Harrison never stopped looking. Long after the headlines faded and the witnesses died or recounted, he continued his quiet search for the proof Isabella had sworn existed. He followed rumors, chased half-forgotten floor plans, pried into basements and attics with the patience of a man who knew the truth had been deliberately misplaced. Yet time outpaced him. He died with the mystery intact, carrying the frustration of unfinished justice into the grave. Decades later, when memory itself had grown brittle, the past reached out. In the middle of routine renovations at the Belmont Hotel, workers uncovered a loose brick in a dim basement corridor no guest had ever seen. Behind it rested a sealed envelope, untouched by light or air, marked with Isabella's initials and dated only days before she vanished. Inside lay the silence she had preserved, meticulous financial ledgers, private correspondence tying Newport's most powerful families to compromised officials, drawings that revealed hidden chambers threaded through grand homes like veins beneath marble skin. It was the missing voice, sealed away for more than half a century, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. When the contents were finally examined, every accusation Isabella had made hardened into fact. The conspiracy was not confined to one town or a handful of names. It spread outward, touching judges, lawmakers, industrialists, men whose authority had once seemed unquestionable. But the revelation arrived too late for the courtroom. Those responsible were already dust, and the laws they had bent shielded them even in death. Justice, delayed beyond reach, became something else entirely. The hotel surrendered the documents to the Newport Historical Society, where they were displayed beneath glass. Visitors often described an unnatural chill in that room. They lingered over Isabella's final photographs, over her careful handwriting, sensing a presence that felt less like mourning and more like watchfulness. as though she stood just beyond sight, ensuring nothing was omitted again. The room where she spent her last nights refused to settle into normalcy. Even after being repurposed, whispers followed it. Guests complained of perfume drifting through empty air. A staff spoke of quiet sobbing when the corridors were deserted. Some felt eyes on them, patient and unblinking. Eventually the number was removed, the space reduced to storage, yet the disturbances did not fade. It was as if the walls remembered. Years later, a historian devoted decades to untangling Isabella's story. Her work brought renewed attention to the case, not as a singular tragedy, but as evidence of a larger, uglier pattern. She concluded that Isabella had not been killed for love or shame, but for profit, for threatening the machinery that turned power into wealth without scrutiny. Her death, the historian argued, was a transaction, a calculated decision made by men who viewed lives as expendable assets. The story refused to die. Modern investigators eventually reopened the file, applying contemporary techniques to century-old evidence. They acknowledged the obvious truth. Prosecution was impossible. Too much time had passed. Too much had been erased. Yet the purpose had shifted. What mattered now was not punishment, but understanding. Isabella's fate had become a lens through which power, corruption, and consequence could finally be examined without illusion. Her murder stood as proof that secrets protected by wealth demand blood. That exposure carries a price few survive, and that those who challenge entrenched authority often do so knowing they may not live to see vindication. The families who orchestrated her end escaped the courts, but not the fallout. Their empires crumbled under the same corruption they had nurtured. Reputations rotted. Fortunes dissolved. Names once spoken with reverence became synonymous with disgrace. They were undone not by vengeance, but by the slow inevitability of truth asserting itself. This is gospel of the haunted, where silence never truly silences. Isabella Fairmont lost everything when she refused to look away, but her sacrifice ensured the darkness she uncovered could not remain sealed forever. Somewhere beneath Newport's elegance, beneath its locked doors and polished stone, echoes remain. Questions linger, and the truth, patient and relentless, waits for anyone brave enough to listen.